Have you ever wondered what you'd do if you discovered that everything you believed about someone was a lie? Victoria Hayes, a dedicated 32-year-old nurse, was about to live through the biggest nightmare of her professional and personal life. Working the night shift in the palliative care unit at St. Mary's Hospital in Boston, she thought she'd seen it all. Desperate patients, grieving families, heart-wrenching goodbyes. But nothing prepared her for what was coming when a mysterious man was admitted on a rainy Tuesday in October. Ryan Mitchell arrived like any other terminal patient, polite, reserved, carrying the weight of someone who knows their days are numbered. But there was something about him that Victoria couldn't decipher, something that made her feel butterflies in her stomach every time she entered room 314. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, as if he could see straight through to her soul. Or perhaps it was the way he spoke, always choosing his words with a care that seemed to hide deep secrets. Victoria tried to maintain professional distance, but something magnetic about this man pulled her like an invisible force. What began as compassionate medical care soon transformed into something far more dangerous. Conversations during silent midnight hours, glances that lasted longer than they should, an emotional connection that grew stronger each day. Victoria knew she was treading on forbidden ground, but she couldn't resist Ryan's mysterious charm. He displayed knowledge that didn't match his simple profile, reacted strangely to certain news, and always seemed to be hiding something important. But Victoria could never have imagined the truth behind those enigmatic eyes. Because sometimes, when you fall for the wrong person, you discover that love can be the most dangerous weapon in the world, especially when you have no idea who's really holding the trigger. You know that feeling when life seems to be running on autopilot? That's exactly how Victoria Hayes felt every night as she walked through the quiet corridors of St. Mary's Hospital. At 32, she'd seen everything in that palliative care unit: heartbreaking stories, unforgettable farewells, and a routine that, however heavy, had become her comfort zone. Victoria wasn't one of those nurses who did the job just for the paycheck. She genuinely cared about each patient, treating everyone like family. But let's be honest, after 8 years in the profession, even the most generous hearts develop a certain emotional protection. It was as if she'd developed invisible armor that allowed her to care without getting too involved. After all, in that place, excessive attachment could be more of a curse than a blessing. The professional ethics she valued so much functioned like a shield, keeping her focused on what really mattered, providing dignity and comfort in life's final moments. Victoria believed she'd found the perfect balance between compassion and professionalism, never imagining that this certainty was about to be tested in a way she could never predict. The night shift in Boston had its peculiarities, the city that never completely slept, but during the early hours revealed its more introspective and melancholic side. Victoria liked this period because it was when she could really connect with patients, away from the day's rush and constant family visits. It was in these silent moments that the deepest conversations happened, where masks fell and people showed who they really were beneath all that social facade we carry around daily. She'd learned to read between the lines, to sense when someone needed a friendly ear or just a comforting smile. Her experience told her that each patient arrived carrying not just an illness, but an entire story of dreams, regrets, and hopes. Victoria took pride in being able to see beyond medical diagnoses, treating each person as a unique and complex universe. This ability to create genuine connections was what set her apart from many colleagues and made patients feel truly welcomed. But she never imagined that this same sensitivity that helped her so much professionally would be exactly what would put her in a completely unexpected situation. It was on a rainy Tuesday in October that Ryan Mitchell arrived at the hospital, bringing with him a different energy that Victoria couldn't quite define. He wasn't like the other terminal patients she was used to receiving. There was something in his eyes that contrasted with the typical resignation of someone who knew their days were numbered. Ryan seemed to carry secrets, as if behind that facade of a simple sick man there were layers upon layers of untold stories. Victoria immediately noticed the polite way he addressed everyone, from doctors to cleaning staff, always with a please and thank you that sounded genuine, not forced. At 35, he had that kind of presence that filled a room without being invasive, a rare quality that sparked Victoria's professional curiosity. She found herself observing the details, the way he held his book, his upright posture even in the hospital bed, how his eyes moved when someone entered the room. There was a natural elegance about him that didn't match the socioeconomic profile described in his medical file. Victoria tried to ignore these observations, attributing them to her tendency to overanalyze people, but something inside inside her whispered that Ryan Mitchell was much more complex than he appeared. What intrigued Victoria most was how Ryan dealt with his diagnosis. He didn't show the desperation, anger, or denial she was used to witnessing. Instead, he seemed almost relieved, as if being in that hospital was exactly where he needed to be at that moment. This perception made Victoria question whether she was misinterpreting the signs. After all, everyone reacts differently when facing their own mortality. But her years of experience caring for terminal patients told her there was something different here, something that broke the pattern. Ryan answered medical questions precisely, but always left a feeling that he was withholding important information. Victoria found herself paying more attention to him than she should, justifying to herself that it was just professional diligence. She began noticing small details, the quality of his personal clothes, which seemed too expensive for someone without private health insurance, the way he spoke on the phone, always quietly and with an almost conspiratorial tone, and especially how he changed the subject whenever someone asked about his family or work. Victoria knew she was stepping into dangerous territory by being so interested in a patient, but something inside her insisted that Ryan Mitchell wasn't who he claimed to be. Victoria's routine began to take on a new rhythm with Ryan's presence in the hospital. She found herself organizing her schedule to spend more time in his room, always finding a valid professional excuse, checking vital signs, adjusting medication, or simply ensuring he was comfortable. Ryan seemed to appreciate her company and always welcomed her with a genuine smile that made Victoria's heart race in a way she hadn't experienced in years. They began talking about trivial matters, the weather, the news, the books he read, but Victoria noticed that even in these apparently innocent conversations, Ryan demonstrated knowledge and perspective that didn't match the simple profile his documentation suggested. She tried to keep the conversation professional, but Ryan had a way of asking questions about her life that seemed genuinely interested, not just polite. Victoria found herself sharing details about her routine, her personal tastes, and even some work frustrations, something she rarely did with patients. The professional ethics that had always been her guiding principle began to blur in his presence, and Victoria didn't know how to handle this new dynamic. She questioned whether she was being too professional or if, on the contrary, she was crossing lines she shouldn't cross. The nights at the hospital took on a different quality with Ryan there. Victoria discovered he was an insomniac, just like she'd always been, and this created a kind of silent complicity between them during the empty early hours. While other patients slept, they whispered about everything and nothing, creating an intimacy that Victoria knew shouldn't exist, but felt too natural to resist. Ryan had interesting opinions about literature, cinema, and music, always showing refined taste that contrasted with the simplicity he claimed to have. Victoria began bringing him books initially as part of the humanized care the hospital encouraged, but later because she genuinely wanted to share her favorite reads with someone who would appreciate them. These literary exchanges became the highlight of Victoria's shifts, as she found herself eager to know his opinion on each new book. She noticed how Ryan carefully chose his words, as if constantly editing what he really wanted to say. Victoria began to suspect there was much more behind that carefully constructed facade, but still couldn't imagine how deep the abyss of secrets Ryan carried really was. Something inside her whispered that she was about to discover truths that would change everything she thought she knew about him. The feeling that Ryan was hiding something important grew each day, but Victoria fought against her own instincts, trying to convince herself she was imagining things. After all, what kind of secrets could a simple sick man have? She scolded herself for creating mysteries where there probably weren't any, attributing her excessive curiosity to the fact that she'd been without a serious relationship for too long. Victoria tried to stay focused on work, constantly reminding herself that Ryan was her patient, not a romantic interest. But it was impossible to ignore the chemistry that existed between them, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, or how his voice changed tone when he spoke to her. Victoria knew she was walking a thin line between professionalism and something much more dangerous, but no matter how hard she tried to maintain emotional distance, Ryan had a way of disarming all her defenses with his genuine kindness and discreet charm. She began to question whether she was being unfair to herself by denying these naturally arising feelings, but at the same time, her professional ethics screamed that this was forbidden territory. The truth was that Victoria had never found herself in such a complex situation, where her personal and professional principles came into direct conflict. She knew she needed to make a decision about how to handle these growing feelings, but something told her that Ryan Mitchell was about to reveal aspects of himself that would make this decision even more complicated than she could ever imagine. Have you ever had that moment when an apparently innocent conversation reveals much more than it should? That's exactly what happened on a Thursday night when Victoria decided to comment on the book Ryan was reading, a rare edition of The Great Gatsby she'd borrowed from the hospital library. What began as casual small talk about literature quickly transformed into a revelation that left Victoria completely bewildered. Ryan didn't just know the work deeply, but began quoting passages from memory and making analyses that seemed to come from someone with academic training in literature. He spoke about symbolism, historical context, and even other Fitzgerald works, with a naturalness that didn't match the blue-collar worker profile listed in his medical file. Victoria found herself observing every word, every facial expression, trying to understand how a man who supposedly had worked his whole life in construction could have such refined knowledge about art and culture. The conversation flowed so naturally that Ryan seemed to have completely forgotten to maintain his facade of simplicity, revealing layers of sophistication that definitely shouldn't have been there. Victoria felt like she was watching a theater performance where the actor had broken character without realizing it, showing who he really was beneath the carefully constructed mask. The situation became even more intriguing when Ryan began talking about French wines, mentioning specific vintages and wine regions with the knowledge of someone who had not only tasted these expensive drinks, but who understood deeply about enology. Victoria, who could barely distinguish a red wine from a white, was fascinated and at the same time confused by his ease in describing tasting notes and food pairings. How the hell did a man who claimed to have spent his life working construction sites know so much about wines that cost more than most people's monthly salary? Ryan spoke about trips through Tuscany and the Bordeaux region as if they were personal memories, not information taken from books or documentaries. Victoria tried to process this information, searching for a logical explanation that made sense with his socioeconomic profile, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't fit the puzzle pieces together. The way he described flavors and experiences was too visceral to be just theoretical knowledge, and Victoria began to suspect that Ryan had lived a very different life from the one he claimed to have had. She wondered if she wasn't facing someone who had lost everything and now hid behind a false identity, or if there was something even more complex behind that elaborate lie. It was when the phone rang that the situation really got strange. Victoria was organizing medications when she heard Ryan answer with a cautious, "Hello," almost whispered. The conversation that followed was a careful dance of half-words and codes that definitely weren't typical of a common family call. Ryan spoke in numbers, dates, and names that Victoria didn't recognize, always looking toward the door as if he feared being overheard. Most impressive was how his body posture completely changed during the call, from resigned patient to someone who was clearly used to giving orders and making important decisions. Victoria pretended to be focused on her tasks, but every fiber of her being was focused on trying to decipher that enigmatic conversation. When Ryan noticed she was nearby, his voice became even lower and he began speaking even more cryptically, using terms that sounded like corporate or financial jargon. The call ended abruptly when he saw Victoria approaching, and the embarrassment in his eyes was impossible to disguise. Ryan tried to explain that it was just a friend checking how he was doing, but the lie was so obvious that even a child would notice. Victoria smiled and pretended to believe him, but inside her mind was buzzing with questions she knew she couldn't ask directly. The last straw came when Victoria was adjusting the room's television and passed by a financial news channel. Ryan's reaction was instantaneous and impossible to hide. He became visibly tense, his muscles contracted, and he quickly asked to change the channel, claiming that news made him depressed. But Victoria had caught the flash of recognition and even fear that passed through his eyes when a certain company was mentioned in the report. It wasn't just discomfort or disinterest. It was the reaction of someone who had a personal and probably problematic connection to what was being reported. Victoria changed the channel as requested, but couldn't get the way Ryan had reacted out of her head, as if that news represented a real threat to him. She began connecting the dots, the sophisticated knowledge, the mysterious calls, the reaction to financial news. Everything pointed to someone who had or had had connections to the high-level corporate world. Victoria wondered if Ryan was running from something, if he had committed some financial crime, or if he was simply trying to escape a life he no longer wanted to live. Curiosity was killing her inside, but at the same time, part of her feared discovering the truth about who Ryan really was. While processing all these disturbing discoveries, Victoria realized that something even more complicated was happening. She was falling in love with Ryan regardless of who he was or what he was hiding. The feelings she had tried to deny were becoming impossible to ignore, and with each conversation, each smile from him, each moment of intimacy shared during the silent early hours, Victoria felt her heart surrendering more and more. It was as if her soul recognized something in his soul that went beyond lies and masks, a genuine connection that transcended the strange circumstances that had brought them together. But at the same time, her professional ethics screamed constant alarms, reminding her that she was crossing all the lines lines she had sworn never to cross. Victoria found herself torn between following her heart, which insisted that Ryan was a good person just going through difficulties, and her reason, which warned of the dangers of getting emotionally involved with someone who clearly wasn't who he claimed to be. She knew she was walking on dangerous ground, but the attraction she felt for him was too magnetic to resist. Victoria began to question whether she wasn't being naive to believe she could separate her personal feelings from her professional responsibilities, especially when Ryan showed clear signs that he was also interested in her. The tension between what Victoria knew she should do and what her heart wanted to do was becoming unbearable. She spent her days trying to maintain a professional posture, but the nights revealed a growing intimacy that went far beyond the nurse-patient relationship. Ryan had a way of looking at her that made Victoria feel seen and valued in a way she hadn't experienced in years, and this genuine attention was like a balm for her lonely soul. They had developed their own language made of glances, discreet smiles, and conversations loaded with subtext, creating a private world within that hospital room. Victoria knew she was falling in love not just with the mysterious version of Ryan, but with the person he showed himself to be when he let his guard down: gentle, intelligent, funny, and surprisingly vulnerable. She began fantasizing about a future where they could be together outside that hospital environment, where professional ethics rules wouldn't apply, and where she could freely explore the feelings growing inside her. But whenever these romantic daydreams took over her mind, reality pulled her back. Ryan was hiding something important, and Victoria had no idea how deep the secrets he carried really were. She sensed she was about to discover truths that would completely change the dynamic between them, but couldn't imagine whether these revelations would bring them even closer together or separate them forever. What Victoria didn't know was that her growing curiosity and her discreet attempts to better understand Ryan hadn't gone unnoticed by him. Ryan had noticed the investigative looks, the apparently casual questions about his past, and especially the way she paid attention to every detail of their conversations and reactions. He found himself in an impossible position. The more time he spent with Victoria, the more he fell in love with her, but at the same time, he knew he was living a lie that could destroy any chance of a real relationship between them. Ryan began to question whether he should reveal his true identity, risking not only his safety, but also Victoria's heart, which he could see was surrendering more and more. The irony of the situation didn't escape him. He had found true love exactly at the moment when he was living the biggest farce of his life. Ryan knew Victoria deserved the truth, but he also knew that this truth could put her in danger and would definitely destroy the trust she had placed in him. He found himself watching her work, admiring her dedication and compassion, and feeling increasingly guilty for involving her in his complicated situation. Ryan sensed he wouldn't be able to maintain his facade much longer, especially with Victoria showing herself to be increasingly perceptive and determined to discover who he really was. You know that feeling when you have a gut instinct that something doesn't add up and you just can't let it go? Victoria was in exactly that situation, and no matter how hard she tried to convince herself she was imagining things, her intuition screamed that Ryan Mitchell was hiding secrets that went far beyond a simple lie about his past. It was on a Friday during her break that she decided to do something she'd never done in 8 years of practice: discreetly investigate a patient. Victoria knew she was stepping into ethically questionable territory, but the need to understand who the man she was falling for really was spoke louder than her professional scruples. She started by reviewing Ryan's medical documentation, looking for inconsistencies that might confirm her suspicions. What she found was even more disturbing than she'd expected: addresses that didn't exist, employment references that didn't check out, and a medical history that seemed hastily constructed. Victoria felt a chill in her stomach as she realized that practically everything in Ryan's file was an elaborate lie, a facade so well constructed that it had slipped past the hospital bureaucracy. She wondered how someone could falsify medical documents with such precision, and more importantly, why someone would do this just to hide in a hospital. The discovery confirmed her suspicions, but at the same time opened an abyss of new questions that left her even more intrigued and worried. Victoria's investigation intensified when she decided to discreetly verify the personal information Ryan had provided during admission. Using the hospital computers during her breaks, she tried to confirm basic details like residential address, employment history, and even family references. What she discovered was shocking. The address Ryan had given corresponded to an empty lot in a neighborhood that had been demolished 3 years ago to make way for a shopping mall. The company where he claimed to have worked as a construction worker had no record of an employee with that name in the past 5 years. Even the emergency contact number he'd provided had been disconnected for months. Victoria found herself facing a disturbing reality. Ryan Mitchell, at least in the version he presented, simply didn't exist. She tried to find rational explanations. Maybe he'd changed his name for some legal reason poison, or perhaps he was fleeing an abusive relationship. But the more she investigated, the more obvious it became that she was dealing with someone who had constructed a completely false identity. The discovery left her torn between curiosity to discover the truth and fear that this truth might be more dangerous than she was prepared to face. Victoria began to question whether she wasn't getting into something much bigger than she could handle, but at the same time, she couldn't stop investigating. Parallel to her disturbing discoveries, the relationship between Victoria and Ryan continued deepening in a way she'd never experienced before. The conversations during the early morning hours became even more intimate and meaningful, creating an emotional connection that transcended the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Ryan showed genuine interest in her life, asking questions about her dreams, fears, and aspirations that went far beyond polite courtesy. He listened to her stories with total attention that made Victoria feel valued and understood in a way she hadn't experienced in years. They talked about philosophy, art, music, and literature with a naturalness that suggested a rare and precious intellectual compatibility. Victoria found herself sharing thoughts and feelings she normally kept to herself, creating an emotional intimacy that both scared and thrilled her. Ryan had a way of making insightful comments about human nature and life that revealed a depth of experience and reflection that didn't match the age he claimed to have. Victoria felt like she was meeting someone who understood her soul in a way few had managed, and this deep connection made it even harder to deal with the lies she knew he was telling. She found herself in an impossible situation: how to fall completely in love with someone while discovering that everything he'd told her about himself was an elaborate performance. The emotional tension Victoria felt was becoming almost unbearable. During the day, she tried to maintain her professional posture, but at night, when she was alone with Ryan, all her self-preservation instincts seemed to disappear. They had developed an intimacy that went far beyond words. There were casual touches that lasted longer than they should, looks that communicated much more than any conversation, and moments of shared silence that were loaded with romantic tension. Victoria knew she was crossing all the ethical lines she'd sworn to respect, but the attraction she felt for Ryan was too magnetic to resist. She found herself inventing excuses to spend more time in his room, always finding some medical task that justified her prolonged presence. Ryan seemed to be going through the same internal conflict. Victoria could see in his eyes the same desire and hesitation she felt. There were moments when they got so close that Victoria could feel his breathing, and the tension in the air was so palpable, it seemed like any wrong move could break the fragile barrier they still maintained between professional and personal. Victoria knew she was falling head over heels, but at the same time, the discoveries about Ryan's lies created a shadow of doubt that made it impossible to surrender completely to her feelings. She constantly questioned whether what she felt for him was real, or if she was falling in love with a carefully constructed illusion. The situation became even more complicated when Victoria began to notice that Ryan was also discreetly investigating her. She realized he was asking apparently casual questions about her routine, her co-workers, and even about the hospital's security procedures. Initially, Victoria attributed this curiosity to natural romantic interest, but soon realized there was something more calculated about these questions. Ryan wanted to know about other nurses' schedules, about who had access to which areas of the hospital, and about how the patient monitoring system worked. Victoria began to suspect that Ryan wasn't just hiding his identity, but that perhaps he was using the hospital as a hideout from something or someone. The possibility that she might be being emotionally manipulated as part of a larger plan made her nauseous and furious. She wondered if the feelings Ryan showed for her were genuine, or if they were part of an elaborate strategy to gain her trust and obtain information. Victoria found herself questioning every intimate moment they'd shared, every deep conversation, every meaningful look. Everything could have been a carefully orchestrated performance. Doubt began to corrode the trust she'd placed in him, but at the same time, her heart insisted that the connection between them was too real to be fake. Victoria found herself at an impossible emotional crossroads: follow her self-preservation instinct and distance herself from Ryan, or risk everything to discover the truth about who he really was. Victoria's dilemma intensified when she realized she wasn't the only person interested in Ryan Mitchell. During one of her discreet investigations, she noticed that someone had accessed the hospital system to check information about him, someone with credentials she didn't recognize and who definitely wasn't part of the regular medical staff. Victoria discovered that there were people looking for Ryan, and these people had resources and access to systems that suggested high-level government or corporate involvement. The discovery terrified her because it confirmed that Ryan wasn't just hiding his identity for simple personal reasons. He was running from something or someone powerful enough to track hospital records. Victoria found herself in a dangerous situation that went far beyond a simple forbidden romance. She was potentially involved in a situation that could put her own safety at risk. She began noticing small details that had previously gone unnoticed. Strange cars in the hospital parking lot, people who seemed to be watching blocking the entrance to the wing where Ryan was admitted, and even colleagues asking casual questions about the patient in room 314. Victoria realized she was at the center of something much bigger and more dangerous than she'd imagined, but at the same time, she couldn't abandon Ryan when he clearly needed protection. She found herself forced to make a decision that would change her life forever, reveal her discoveries and potentially hand Ryan over to whoever was looking for him, or protect him and risk her own safety and career. The love she felt for him was about to be tested in a way she could never have predicted. The emotional and psychological pressure Victoria was facing began affecting all aspects of her life. She found herself making small mistakes at work, forgetting routine procedures, and having difficulty concentrating on other patients. Her colleagues began noticing changes in her behavior, and Victoria knew she couldn't maintain the facade of normalcy much longer. She spent nights awake, not just because of her shifts, but because her mind couldn't stop processing all the contradictory information about Ryan. Victoria found herself constantly torn between the need to protect her career and professional ethics, and the overwhelming desire to protect the man she'd fallen in love with, regardless of who he was or what he'd done. She knew she was reaching a point of no return, where she'd have to choose between following the rules that had always guided her life or following her heart into completely unknown and potentially dangerous territory. Victoria sensed that the truth about Ryan was about to come to light, and that when it did, nothing in her life would be the same. She mentally prepared herself for discoveries that could destroy everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and human nature, but also knew there was no going back. She needed to know who Ryan really was, no matter the price she'd have to pay for that truth. Have you ever had that moment when your entire reality crumbles in a matter of seconds? That's exactly what happened to Victoria on a rainy Tuesday when she finally discovered who Ryan Mitchell really was. The revelation came unexpectedly. Through an investigative report that aired on the nursing station television during her break, Victoria nearly dropped her coffee when she saw Ryan's face, or rather, Christopher Ashford's, plastered on the screen as the billionaire heir who had died in a yacht accident 6 months ago. The report detailed a corporate corruption scandal involving Ashford Industries, one of the largest investment companies in the United States, and how Christopher had mysteriously disappeared shortly before being summoned to testify before a congressional committee. Victoria felt the ground disappear from under her feet as she realized she'd fallen in love with someone who had not only lied about his identity, but was fleeing justice after being involved in schemes that had stolen millions of dollars from workers' retirement and pension funds. The irony was too cruel to be coincidence. She, a nurse who dedicated her life to caring for people, had fallen in love with someone who represented everything she despised: privilege, corruption, and contempt for the less fortunate. Victoria felt like an idiot for believing Christopher's elaborate facade, but at the same time couldn't reconcile the image of the gentle, vulnerable man she'd known with that of the corrupt businessman the media portrayed. The discovery of Christopher's true identity brought an avalanche of contradictory emotions that Victoria didn't know how to process. On one hand, she felt betrayed and manipulated in a way she'd never experienced. Every intimate conversation, every moment of shared vulnerability, every subtle declaration of affection now seemed like a calculated lie. Victoria wondered if Christopher had specifically chosen to approach her because he knew a nurse would be less likely to suspect his true identity, or if he'd seen in her a convenient opportunity to obtain information about the hospital's operations. The possibility of being emotionally used as part of an elaborate escape plan made her nauseous and furious. On the other hand, Victoria couldn't completely ignore the genuine moments of connection she'd felt with him. There was something in Christopher's eyes, especially during their deepest conversations, that seemed too real to be just a performance. She struggled between accepting that everything had been an elaborate facade or believing that, beneath all the lies, something true had existed between them. Victoria felt like she was trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces were false, but a few were genuine, and she couldn't distinguish one from the other. The pain of betrayal mixed with the confusion of still feeling love for someone she now discovered was completely different from what she'd imagined. The confrontation between Victoria and Christopher was inevitable and devastating. She waited until the night shift, when the hospital was quieter, to enter his room with the determination of someone who had finally decided to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Christopher immediately noticed from her expression that something had changed, and Victoria saw in his eyes the same recognition she'd felt, the moment when both knew the facade had come to an end. When she mentioned the name Christopher Ashford, he didn't try to deny or continue the lie. Instead, his shoulders dropped in a posture of defeat that revealed the weight he'd been carrying maintaining that performance. The conversation that followed was an explosive mixture of accusations, desperate explanations, and raw emotions that neither was prepared to face. Christopher tried to explain that his death had been the only way to escape real threats against his life, that he'd discovered corruption in his own company and was trying to expose the real culprits when he was forced to flee. Victoria listened to his explanations with a mixture of skepticism and desperation, wanting to believe there was a noble justification for all the lies, but at the same time, knowing that nothing he said could erase the fact that she'd been deceived from day one. The professional ethics that had always been her guide now screamed that she should report him immediately, but her heart begged her to at least hear the whole story before making any decision. The most shocking revelation came when Christopher admitted that his medical condition was also a lie. He wasn't dying, he'd just simulated symptoms and falsified tests to justify his prolonged stay in the hospital. Victoria felt like she'd been punched in the stomach as she realized that even the compassion she'd felt for a supposedly terminal man had been based on a cruel facade. She remembered all the times she'd worried about his well-being, how she'd adjusted her routine to ensure he received the best possible care, and how she'd fought against her own feelings, believing it would be cruel to emotionally take advantage of someone facing death. The discovery that Christopher had manipulated not only his identity, but also his medical condition, made Victoria question absolutely everything about her ability to judge people's character. She felt like an incompetent professional who had failed to identify obvious signs that something was wrong, and like a naive woman who had allowed her emotions to cloud her judgment. Christopher tried to explain that he'd really developed genuine feelings for her, that nothing that had happened between them had been calculated or false, but Victoria could no longer distinguish between truth and lies coming from his mouth. She wondered how she could trust anything he said after discovering that his very existence in the hospital was based on a complex web of deception and manipulation. The moral dilemma Victoria faced was devastating and unprecedented in her life. On one hand, her professional ethics and responsibility as a citizen demanded that she report Christopher to the authorities. He was a fugitive from justice who had used medical resources under false pretenses, potentially taking a bed from someone who really needed palliative care. On the other hand, his explanations about fleeing death threats and trying to expose the real corruption in his company created a shadow of doubt about who the real villains were in this story. Victoria struggled between seeing Christopher as a cowardly criminal who had fled his responsibilities, or as a victim of circumstances who had been forced to take desperate measures to survive. The complexity of the situation was aggravated by the genuine feelings she still had for him. Even knowing she'd been deceived, Victoria couldn't simply turn off the love she'd developed during those weeks of growing intimacy. She found herself in an impossible position where any decision she made would result in devastating consequences. Reporting Christopher would mean potentially condemning him to death if the threats against him were real, but protecting him would mean becoming an accomplice to a fugitive and irreparably compromising her career and professional integrity. Victoria had never felt so lost and confused, torn between doing what was legally right and what her heart insisted was morally justified. The emotional pressure of the situation began affecting Victoria in ways she hadn't anticipated. She found herself questioning not only her recent decisions, but her entire capacity for judgment and discernment that she'd developed over years of professional experience. How had she been so easily deceived by someone who was clearly playing a role? What other obvious signs had she missed throughout her career? Victoria began doubting her competence as a nurse and as a person, feeling as if her entire professional identity had been shaken by the discovery that she'd failed so spectacularly to identify such an elaborate facade. At the same time, she struggled against the realization that she still loved Christopher, despite everything she'd discovered about him. The feelings she'd developed didn't magically disappear with the revelation of his true identity. If anything, the vulnerability he'd shown during the confession only intensified her emotional connection to him. Victoria hated herself for still caring about someone who had lied to her so systematically, but couldn't control the emotions that had developed during those weeks of growing intimacy. She found herself in an internal battle between her reason, which insisted Christopher was dangerous and manipulative, and her heart, which refused to accept that everything they'd shared had been an illusion. The discovery that love can survive even the most devastating betrayal was a lesson Victoria wasn't prepared to learn, especially not under these impossible circumstances. The most painful moment came when Victoria realized that, regardless of her future decisions, she had forever lost the possibility of a relationship based on trust and honesty with Christopher. Even if she decided to protect and help him, how could she build something real with someone whose first impression had been an elaborate lie? How could she be sure that anything he said in the future would be true? Victoria realized that Christopher had destroyed not only her trust in him, but her ability to trust her own instincts and judgments. She wondered if she'd ever be able to relate to someone again without constantly questioning whether she was being deceived, if she'd be able to practice her profession without doubting her ability to assess people's character. The betrayal had created wounds that went far beyond the romantic. It had shaken the foundations of who Victoria believed herself to be as a person and as a professional. Christopher tried to argue that the feelings between them had been real, that the connection they'd developed transcended the circumstances of how they met, but Victoria could no longer distinguish between what had been genuine and what had been performance. She found herself forced to accept that she might never know the complete truth about what had happened between them, and that this uncertainty would be something she'd have to learn to live with. The love story that had begun as a fairy tale was transforming into a tragedy where there were no winners, only victims of circumstances that had completely spiraled out of both their control. Have you ever had the feeling that a single decision can destroy the entire life you've built? Victoria was about to discover that the consequences of falling in love with Christopher Ashford went far beyond a broken heart. The first bomb exploded the morning after the revelation, when the hospital director, Dr. Margaret Collins, called Victoria for an urgent meeting in her office. What Victoria found there left her frozen. 2 federal agents, a representative from the hospital's legal department, and a pile of documents detailing every interaction she'd had with the patient in room 314. Apparently, the authorities had been investigating Christopher's presence at the hospital for weeks, and now Victoria was being questioned about her possible complicity in helping a fugitive from justice. The questions were direct and intimidating. Did she know his true identity? Had she helped Christopher maintain his facade? Had she received any kind of financial compensation for her cooperation? Victoria found herself in a Kafkaesque situation where her honesty about knowing nothing was interpreted as evidence that she was a skilled liar, and where every gesture of professional care she'd shown was reinterpreted as proof of complicity. The cruel irony of the situation didn't escape her. She was being accused of corruption exactly for having done her job with dedication and compassion, qualities she'd always considered her greatest professional virtues. The hospital's internal investigation was relentless and humiliating in a way Victoria could never have imagined. Every co-worker was interrogated about their interactions with her and with the mysterious patient, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that transformed the work environment she loved into an emotional minefield. Victoria discovered that casual conversations she'd had with colleagues about Ryan Christopher were being analyzed for evidence that she knew more than she claimed. Worse still, she realized that some colleagues she considered friends now looked at her with suspicion, questioning whether the dedicated nurse they'd known for years was actually a person capable of betrayal and lies. The hospital administration suspended Victoria temporarily while the investigation was ongoing, effectively destroying her professional reputation before any formal charges were even made. She found herself isolated and ostracized by the medical community that had been her second family, treated as a pariah by people who had previously respected and admired her. Victoria realized that, regardless of the investigation's final outcome, her career at St. Mary's Hospital was effectively over. Even if she were cleared of any wrongdoing, the shadow of suspicion would always hover over her. The discovery that the professional reputation she'd taken years to build could be destroyed in a matter of days was a devastating blow that left her questioning whether it's worth being honest and dedicated in a world where the appearance of impropriety is as damaging as actual impropriety. While Victoria fought to save her career, a new threat emerged that made her realize her problems went far beyond professional issues. She began noticing disturbing signs that she was being watched, cars that appeared repeatedly in places where she was, people who seemed to be observing her apartment, and phone calls where no one spoke on the other end. Initially, Victoria attributed these occurrences to paranoia caused by the stress of the investigation, but soon realized the threats were real and dangerous. Christopher had mentioned he was fleeing from powerful people who wanted to silence him permanently, and now Victoria was discovering firsthand that these people wouldn't hesitate to threaten anyone who might have information about his whereabouts. The realization that her life could be in real danger because of her innocent involvement with Christopher terrified her in a way she'd never experienced. Victoria found herself forced to change her daily routine, avoid places she regularly frequented, and even consider the possibility of leaving Boston temporarily until the situation resolved. The irony of being pursued for information she didn't possess about a man who had lied to her from their first meeting was too cruel to be real. But Victoria was learning quickly that reality can be much stranger and more dangerous than any fiction. She wondered how her life had transformed so drastically in such a short time, going from a predictable and safe routine to a nightmare of investigations, threats, and constant fear. It was in this moment of total despair that an unexpected ally appeared in Victoria's life. Detective Lauren Brooks, a federal investigator assigned to the Christopher Ashford case, approached Victoria not as a suspect, but as a potential victim who deserved protection and clarification. Lauren had carefully analyzed all the evidence and concluded that Victoria had been manipulated and deceived as much as anyone else involved in the case. During a frank conversation at a discreet cafe away from the hospital, Lauren explained to Victoria the true extent of the corruption Christopher was trying to expose, and how he'd become a target for discovering information that could implicate extremely powerful people in money laundering and corporate fraud schemes. Lauren revealed that Christopher wasn't the main villain of the story, but rather a piece in a much larger game where he'd been used as a scapegoat by people who now wanted to eliminate him permanently. The detective explained that Victoria had become a target not because she knew something, but because the people pursuing Christopher believed she might know where he was hiding. Lauren offered police protection for Victoria and proposed a collaboration where she would help authorities better understand Christopher's personality and possible hideouts in exchange for protection and clearing her name in the investigation. Victoria found herself in a strange position where the same person who had destroyed her life had also become the key to her salvation, and where helping to capture Christopher might be the only way to ensure her own safety. The collaboration with Detective Brooks brought revelations that completely changed Victoria's perspective on Christopher and the entire situation she found herself in. Lauren showed evidence that Christopher had actually tried to expose corruption in his own company before being forced to flee, and that the threats against his life were real and documented. Victoria discovered that Christopher had lost several friends and colleagues who had tried to help him reveal the truth, and that his staged death had been a desperate attempt to buy time to gather enough evidence to expose the real criminals. The information revealed a much more complex man than Victoria had imagined, not the corrupt villain the media portrayed, nor the innocent saint she'd romanticized, but someone who had made serious mistakes, but was trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. Lauren explained that Christopher had chosen to hide in a hospital not just for safety, but because he was genuinely ill, not terminal as he'd claimed, but suffering from extreme stress and health problems related to months of clandestine living and constant fear. Victoria found herself forced to reevaluate all her judgments about Christopher, realizing that reality was much more nuanced than she'd initially believed. The discovery that he'd lied about his identity and medical condition, but had been honest about his feelings for her, created an emotional complexity that Victoria didn't know how to process. She wondered if it was possible to forgive someone for lies that had been told out of survival necessity, and if love could survive such devastating revelations about the loved one. The most shocking moment came when Victoria discovered that Christopher had disappeared from the hospital the night before, leaving only a letter addressed specifically to her. The letter was an emotionally devastating document where Christopher explained his actions, asked forgiveness for the lies, and declared that the feelings he developed for her were the only genuine thing in his life for months. He wrote that he'd left not to flee justice, but to protect her from the consequences of being associated with him, and that he planned to turn himself in to authorities once he could ensure that the evidence he possessed reached the right people. Christopher admitted he'd fallen in love with Victoria in a way he hadn't planned or expected, and that the guilt of involving her in his situation was something that would torment him for the rest of his life. The letter ended with a promise that he would do everything in his power to clear her name and ensure she could resume her life and career without the shadows his presence had created. Victoria read and reread the letter dozens of times, trying to decipher which parts were true and which were emotional manipulation, but deep down, her heart recognized the authenticity of the pain and regret that showed through every word. The letter left her even more confused about her feelings for Christopher, but also gave her a strange sense of closure. Finally, she had a complete explanation for everything that had happened, even if that explanation was more complicated than anything she could have imagined. Victoria realized that Christopher had done the only thing he could do to protect her, disappear from her life completely, leaving her free to rebuild what he had involuntarily destroyed. Christopher's absence brought a contradictory mixture of relief and longing that Victoria hadn't anticipated. On one hand, she felt relieved not to have to deal with the emotional pressure of being in love with someone who had lied to her so systematically. On the other hand, his absence created a void in her life that she didn't know how to fill. Victoria found herself missing the deep conversations they'd shared, the intellectual and emotional connection she'd developed with him, and even the romantic tension that had made her nights at the hospital so exciting. She questioned whether it was normal to miss someone who had caused so much chaos in her life, or if this was evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with her emotional judgment. Detective Brooks continued working with Victoria to try to locate Christopher, but Victoria found herself in a strange position where part of her wanted him to be found and held accountable for his actions, problems, while another part secretly hoped he would manage to escape and find a way to live in peace. The complexity of her feelings left her emotionally exhausted, torn between the need for justice and the desire for the man she'd fallen in love with to find some kind of redemption. Victoria began to realize that the situation had changed her in fundamental ways. She was no longer the naive nurse who had fallen in love with a mysterious patient, but a woman who had been forced to confront the moral complexities of a world where it's not always easy to distinguish between right and wrong, between victim and villain. Do you believe that sometimes life gives us a second chance exactly when we think all is lost? Victoria was about to discover that the ending of her story with Christopher would be very different from what she had imagined. 3 months had passed since his disappearance, 3 months of endless investigations, sleepless nights, and a constant feeling that her life had been turned upside down by forces beyond her control. Victoria had managed to keep her job at the hospital thanks to Detective Brooks's testimony, which confirmed her innocence, but the work atmosphere was never the same. There were always curious glances, whispers in the hallways, and the feeling that she was seen as that nurse who got involved with the billionaire fugitive. She had seriously considered the possibility of moving to another city, starting over somewhere no one knew her story, where she could go back to being just Victoria Hayes, dedicated nurse, and not the woman who had fallen in love with the wrong man at the wrong time. But something inside her refused to run. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was the irrational hope that Christopher would one day return to explain everything properly, or maybe it was simply the stubbornness of not allowing other people to dictate the course of her life. Victoria had learned to live with uncertainty and unanswered questions, but she had never completely stopped wondering where Christopher was and if he was safe. The turning point came in a way Victoria could never have predicted. On a cold January morning, she was leaving the hospital after a particularly difficult shift when she saw a familiar figure waiting for her in the parking lot. Christopher was there, thinner and with a beard he didn't have before, but unmistakably him, waiting with an expression that mixed nervousness, determination, and something that looked very much like hope. Victoria's first instinct was to run, part anger, part fear, part an emotion she couldn't name. But something in his eyes made her stop, something that seemed different from the last time they'd seen each other. Christopher didn't try to approach. Instead, he stayed where he was and simply said, "I came back to clean up the mess I made of your life, and to turn myself in." Victoria felt as if time had stopped. All the emotions she'd tried to suppress over the past months came back at once, creating an internal whirlwind that left her speechless. She wanted to scream at him for disappearing without adequate explanations, wanted to ask where he'd been and why it had taken so long to return, but at the same time, part of her was simply relieved to see him alive and apparently well. Christopher explained that he'd spent the past months gathering irrefutable evidence about the real corruption in his company, working with federal attorneys to ensure that his cooperation would result not only in his own redemption, but in the arrest of the real criminals who had used his company to launder money and defraud investors. He had returned not as a fugitive, but as a protected witness who finally had the necessary tools to expose the truth and clear his name. Christopher's redemption process was long, complex, and publicly humiliating, but Victoria watched it all with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. He voluntarily surrendered to authorities, cooperated completely with all investigations, and used his personal fortune to compensate victims of the fraudulent schemes that had been operated through his company. Victoria saw Christopher testify before congressional committees, face hostile media, and accept responsibility for his part in the crimes, even when it became clear that he had been more victim than perpetrator. The man she had known in the hospital, vulnerable, remorseful, and desperately trying to do the right thing, was finally being seen by the public, replacing the image of the corrupt heir that had dominated headlines for months. Detective Brooks worked tirelessly to ensure that Victoria's role in the story was publicly clarified, confirming that she had been deceived and manipulated, not complicit. The investigation revealed that Christopher had chosen to hide in the hospital, not just for safety, but because he genuinely needed medical care for health problems caused by the extreme stress of his situation. Victoria found herself in a strange position where she was being publicly vindicated. At the same time, Christopher was being partially rehabilitated, creating a public narrative where both were victims of circumstances that had spiraled out of their control. The media, which had previously portrayed Victoria as either a naive nurse or potentially corrupt, now painted her as a hero who had maintained her integrity, even when in love with someone who was was lying to her. The most difficult part of the redemption process was when Christopher was sentenced to 2 years in prison for obstruction of justice and use of false documents, a relatively light sentence considering the gravity of the original charges, but which still meant he would pay a real price for his choices. Victoria found herself in an impossible position. On one hand, she knew Christopher deserved to face the consequences of his actions. On the other hand, she had developed a deep understanding of the circumstances that had led him to make such desperate decisions. She watched the sentence being handed down with conflicted feelings, relief that he was finally facing justice, sadness at seeing him led away in handcuffs, and a strange sense of pride that he had found the courage to return and face the consequences of his actions. Christopher had insisted that Victoria not visit him in prison, arguing that she needed to move forward with her life without the complications his presence would bring. But he wrote regular letters that she read and reread, trying to understand whether the feelings expressed in them were genuine or if there were still elements of emotional manipulation. The letters revealed a man who was using his time in prison to reflect deeply on his choices and on the kind of person he wanted to be when he got out, someone who had found in adversity an opportunity for personal growth that he might never have had in his previous privileged life. Victoria found herself responding to the letters initially with caution, but gradually with more openness, creating a correspondence that allowed both to explore their feelings without the pressure of the dramatic circumstances that had marked their first meeting. Victoria's transformation during this period was as significant as Christopher's. She had learned to navigate the complexities of a world where it's not always easy to distinguish between right and wrong, where good people can make bad decisions for understandable reasons, and where love can survive even the most devastating betrayals. Victoria developed a new perspective on professional ethics that was more nuanced and compassionate, maintaining her high standards, but recognizing that real life is much more complicated than conduct manuals suggest. She became an advocate for healthcare system reforms that would protect both patients and professionals from situations where incomplete or false information could create complex ethical problems. Victoria also discovered an inner strength she didn't know she possessed, the ability to maintain her integrity and compassion even when confronted with situations that tested all her fundamental principles. She had learned that it's possible to love someone deeply even when you don't completely approve of their actions, and that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing, but rather choosing not to let anger and resentment define the future. Victoria found herself in a unique position where she could help other healthcare professionals facing complex ethical dilemmas, offering a perspective that combined practical experience with a deep understanding of the moral complexities that can arise in patient care. She had become a wiser and more resilient person, someone who had faced the worst and discovered she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. The moment of truth came when Christopher was released after serving 18 months of his sentence, with reduction for good behavior and continued cooperation with authorities. Victoria had spent months preparing for this moment, questioning what she felt for him and whether it would be possible to build something real with someone whose first impression had been an elaborate lie. When they met again, it was in a small, discreet cafe away from the media spotlight, a place where they could talk honestly about what had happened and what they wanted for the future. Christopher was visibly changed by the prison experience, more humble, more reflective, and apparently more aware of the impact of his actions on other people. He didn't try to minimize what he'd done or justify his lies. Instead, he took full responsibility and asked forgiveness not just for the lies, but for involving Victoria in a situation that had caused her so much suffering. Victoria found herself facing a man who was simultaneously familiar and strange. She recognized the essence of the person she'd fallen in love with, but also saw the scars and growth that had resulted from his difficult experiences. The conversation was long, emotional, and brutally honest, covering not only the past, but also possibilities for the future. Christopher didn't assume Victoria still had feelings for him, nor did he ask for a second chance. Instead, he simply expressed his gratitude that she had maintained correspondence with him during prison and had found the strength to forgive him, even if that didn't mean they could have a romantic relationship. Victoria's decision to give the relationship a second chance wasn't made lightly or based on naive romanticism. She had spent months in therapy, exploring her feelings and motivations, trying to understand whether she still loved Christopher or was attached to the idea of him. Victoria had learned to distinguish between love based on fantasy and love based on realistic acceptance of who the other person really is, including their flaws and past mistakes. She decided she wanted to try building something with Christopher, but only under very specific conditions: total transparency about past and present, commitment to couples therapy to work on trust issues, and a long and careful dating period before any serious commitment. Christopher accepted all conditions without hesitation, demonstrating a maturity and humility that contrasted drastically with the desperate and lying man she'd known in the hospital. They started slowly, rebuilding their connection on a foundation of radical honesty that was was sometimes uncomfortable, but always genuine. Victoria discovered it was possible to love someone more deeply after going through devastating betrayal, as long as both people were committed to personal growth and mutual honesty. The relationship that emerged was very different from the intense and mysterious romance they'd lived in the hospital. It was more mature, more stable, and based on a realistic understanding of who they were as imperfect people trying to do their best in a complex situation. Victoria had learned that true love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about choosing to grow together with someone who's committed to becoming a better person, even after making serious mistakes. The story of Victoria and Christopher teaches us that true love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about choosing to grow together with someone who's willing to face their own imperfections. Even when lies seem to have destroyed everything, it's still possible to rebuild something stronger and more genuine on the ruins of betrayal. Victoria discovered that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or excusing, but rather choosing not to let anger define the future. She learned that sometimes people lie not out of malice, but out of desperation, and that it's possible to love someone deeply, even when we don't completely approve of their choices. What's most impressive about this story is how an ordinary nurse found the strength to maintain her integrity, even when everything around her was crumbling. Victoria could have chosen the easier path, report Christopher immediately, protect only herself, flee far from all the confusion. But she chose to face the complexity of the situation, seek the complete truth, and in the end, give love a second chance based on radical honesty. Her journey shows us that it's possible to navigate impossible ethical dilemmas while maintaining compassion and wisdom. Christopher, in turn, teaches us about redemption and responsibility. He could have continued running, maintaining his facade, living a life based on lies, but he chose to return, face the consequences, use his fortune to compensate victims, and most importantly, take full responsibility for involving Victoria in his situation. His transformation in prison shows that it's possible to grow and change even after making serious mistakes, as long as there's genuine remorse and commitment to change. This story shows that truth always comes to light, that love can survive even the most devastating betrayals, and that sometimes the most impossible situations teach us the most valuable lessons about who we really are. If this story made you reflect on love, forgiveness, or second chances, share this video with someone who also needs to hear this message. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves a chance at redemption, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that will make you question everything you think you know about the human heart, because sometimes the most unlikely story is exactly the one we need to hear.